So what we're doing, if you're wanting a context for tonight, is we are doing a series on healthy tools for healthy living. And it's really based on I'm going the wrong way. It's based on the reality that one of the things that happens in complex trauma, one of the things that causes a child not to feel safe is when their needs aren't consistently met. So part of what we have done at Finding Freedom React is break kind of what makes us human into 12 basic needs, and they include physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, relational needs. And what happens in complex trauma when a child says, I have a need, please meet it, and it doesn't get met, and they have no way of trying to resolve that need, then they don't feel safe. And the more needs that aren't met, the greater the trauma. And so part of what happens when people come into recovery is they say, thank you for telling us how not having that need affected us, but now we want to know how to meet that need in a healthy way. And so what they have found is that they, as a child, when parents didn't meet that need for them in a healthy way, they found ways to try and meet it, but often the ways they tried and meet it weren't healthy, and it set them up for problems later in their life. And so as I've been thinking about this series, what stood out to me is that almost every one of the 12 needs in complex trauma, you develop an unhealthy relationship with that need. And so this series is saying, what does healthy look like? And then what are the tools that will help me get to healthy? So I want to come at the topic of sex from several different perspectives, much like I've done with food and the other topics that we've had. So the first is just culturally. I don't think you have to be very observant to realize that we have a saturated by sex culture. You can't turn on the TV without encountering that. We've talked about the fastest growing addiction now in the Western Hemisphere is porn addiction, thanks to the internet. It was really interesting to me when we were in Cuba, because the internet is just becoming more available now in Cuba. And guess what they're finding? Kids are on their phone looking at porn all the time. It is a big problem that is developing. Then people develop sex addictions. And the porn addiction, what many don't realize is that if you live in a porn addiction for a long time, at some point you're probably going to need Viagra, because you are no longer able to be stimulated properly by normal sex, and now you need medication to help you. So erectile dysfunction usually has a connection to porn addiction, if you never knew that. The next piece for many people within our culture, sadly, is sexual abuse. So right now in the culture, they say that 25% of women are sexually abused and 16% of men. But what's interesting to me is when you come to the world of complex trauma, 2/3 of women in addiction have sexual abuse, and half of men have sexual abuse issues. So it becomes a huge problem within the complex trauma and the addiction world. The next one is, because of all of this sexualization within our culture, cheating and affairs become rampant, which lead to divorces and separations. But also people get into relationships too soon. And we've talked about what are the criteria that the young people are saying is the criteria they're looking for about whether to date a girl or not. Is she hot? Is she good in bed? And do we have anything in common? That's their basis of determining whether to go on a date. And I go, heaven help us if that's where we are as a culture. And so people are getting into relationships on the wrong criteria too quickly, and then ending up in a very unhealthy relationship, often abusive, toxic. So I find that in many people, when it comes to setting up healthy boundaries in their life, they're very good at setting up lots of boundaries, but it's the sex boundary that's the easiest one to set a good boundary and then change it because you get horny. And all of a sudden, those boundaries don't matter. So within boundary topic, sex has the greatest power to get people to change healthy boundaries that they set for themselves. And then I think for many women, sadly, in our culture, if they go on a date and the guy doesn't pressure them for sex within the first few dates, they begin to think maybe I'm ugly, maybe there's something wrong with me. And so you've been culturally adapted to begin to think that if somebody's not wanting sex from me, then something's wrong with me. And that is another tragedy within our culture. So that's just culture. So let's go a bit deeper to recovery and the challenges that you have if you are in recovery with this whole area of sex. So the problem for many people with sexual addiction, porn addiction, and I should say this, that when you look at cocaine and meth, they stimulate the part of the brain that is designed to create sexual desire. And so what happens in meth addiction and crack or cocaine addiction is there initially is a desire for sexual activity. And so a lot of people develop a dual addiction with crack and meth. So they begin to have a sexual thing that they go through as part of using. After a while, they can't perform anymore, but initially that is part of it. And so a lot of people develop a sexual addiction that goes with their drug addiction. Okay, so now they come into recovery and they still have a sexual desire. And then they go to have sex and their brain goes, I know how this could be a whole lot better. And it pulls them back into their addiction. So it becomes a huge challenge for people to learn how to manage basic sexual drive. Secondly, we still have a desire for sexual intimacy. And if you begin to develop intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy with somebody else, without realizing it, that creates a desire for physical intimacy. And now you've got that to deal with. So you're trying to build healthy relationships. But then as you develop healthy relationships, this whole sexual intimacy begins to become an issue. And these are just funny stories to me. When I used to be at Tamarack, we'd get guys coming to Tamarack straight from jail on parole. And so I always knew their first day at Tamarack, they weren't going to be focused on the workshop because they were thinking about their oil change later that night that they were planning to get. And the next day they'd come back with hickeys up their neck. And you go, oh, how was your evening last night? And that was a very normal thing, and some of you can relate to that. The other thing that I found with a lot of people coming into recovery is they would say, I still think I can have casual sex. So I want to have an F-buddy, or I want to have friends with benefits, whatever you want to call it. And that was their mindset, and I'm going to come back to that. Because for many people, that got them in a lot of trouble. And I want to explain that. So what I have seen over the years is that if people in recovery don't face the sexual component of life, it can lead to relapse very easily. And it can get you into bad relationships and a whole lot of trouble. It is a really big thing. So if you've quit your drug of choice, your brain now is feeling stuff it doesn't want to feel, pain, because you're not medicating it anymore. So your brain is going to start to look for other ways to medicate the pain that you're feeling. And if it can't go back to drugs and alcohol, it will cross-addict to something else. And for many people, their sex addiction kicks back up, and now they've got another addiction happening. So I want to read you something a guy said to me in group. And this was a guy who was in his late 20s. And the whole group was kind of joking about sex and all of that. And nobody was wanting to get really serious or honest about it. And finally, he said this to the whole group. He said, I am a sex addict, and sex is like a drug. But sex, I have learned, is not an innocent pleasure for me. It always results in getting into a relationship or relapsing. As much as I hate to admit it, if I don't change this area of my life, I will never stay clean. And that took a lot of guts. But I've heard, once he said that, you should have seen the change in the group as people started to get honest about this area of their life. So that's sex and recovery. Okay, we're going to go to the third level, sex and complex trauma. And complex trauma does a lot of damage in distorting your relationship with sex. So for some of you, you grew up thinking that sex equals love. So if you have sex with somebody, that must mean you love them. And that is a confusing thing in your mind. The other thing for many people who grow up in complex trauma is they never felt connected to anybody. They didn't get that healthy attachment with parents, with siblings. And so when they experience sex for the first time in their life, they feel a sense of connection, a sense of attachment. And their brain wires get crossed because now what the brain thinks is sex equals true connection. And what I want you to see is true connection is an emotional need, and you can't meet an emotional need with a physical thing. But that's how the brain wires get crossed. Next thing is part of complex trauma, you didn't receive lots of healthy, tender nurture. And so for some, sex seems to provide that. And so now sex becomes their way of getting nurture for their hurts, for their insecurities. And again, the wires get crossed. Another thing, we have shown over and over again that the emotional life of a child in complex trauma is mainly negative emotions or empty. And so if you live with mainly negative emotions or an emptiness and you find sex, it can be the first thing that gives pleasure in your life. And that can set you up to want to pursue it as much as possible. Next thing, sexual abuse. So like we said, 2/3 of women, complex trauma, sexually abused, half of men. And many don't talk about it, but if they start to trust you and feel safe with you and that you won't judge them, they'll start to open up. And I would say I fully agree with those stats, 2/3 and 1/2 for men and women in my experience as a counselor in this field. So what happens when a person is sexually abused is two extremes are possible. Number one is a hatred for sex, makes them feel dirty, don't want anything to do with it. It just brings pain. It makes them feel used like a piece of meat, and they just abhor it, okay? But the other one, and it goes like this. Sex drive was designed to be awakened around 11, 12, 13 puberty. That's when the hormones start to be produced and the sex drive comes alive. But if a child is sexually abused at age 5, it awakens that drive before it was intended to be awakened. And it creates for some people a hyperdrive. They can't get enough. They become sex pursuers, sex chasers. That becomes a driving force in their life. And it becomes a huge problem. The other next piece, and this is a huge part of it, is the effect of shame. So shame is the core belief that I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not valuable. So what the child then does is looks for things that will give them value. So last week we looked how people use money as trying to make a solution to their shame. They can do the same with sex. I remember a client coming to me and in a very embarrassed way, She says, I have to admit this to somebody, and I want it to be you. But when I was in middle school and high school, all of the girls I hung around with, we had little black books. And what we did in those books is we kept track of the people we slept with. And the person with the most names in their black book was the most valuable person. So they tried to solve their shame by saying, look at me, more guys want to sleep with me than you. So that means I'm desirable. That means I'm better than you. And so that becomes a thing. So body image, sexual performance can easily become the things that cause women to say, this is what gives me my value. And when that happens, getting older becomes a huge challenge as bodies begin to change. Or when they go out with a guy and the guy doesn't want sex, they then have shame come up that something must be wrong with them. Another thing for a lot of people is sex satisfies that deep, deep longing that somebody would desire me. So if I can get them to desire me sexually, that's better than not being desired at all. And so that is what they're willing to settle for. Others, sex becomes the thing that gives them power. So they know how to dangle a carrot in front of guys' noses and lead them around and just feel powerful over those guys. And so that it then is sex fulfills a purpose in their life, isn't healthy, but for them it gives them a rush. And it is part of the complex trauma thing. Then sex becomes a great way to medicate pain, sadness, boredom, emptiness, or to just escape from stress in their life, or to feel superior to others. And I talked about the competition of the black book, and then a solution to the haunting loneliness that happens. So complex trauma, you can be surrounded by people, but feel all alone. And then for some, they go even further. They isolate until the haunting loneliness drives them to a relationship, which usually is sexual, to try to solve that. So that's 3 different perspectives on sex within culture, recovery, and complex trauma. So I hope what you see from that is that it affects a lot of stuff. Now, you might still be of the opinion that says, are you sure it's really a big deal? Is it as big a deal as you're making it? And I don't want to try to beat this to death, but I just want you to think about it as honestly as you can. So the first thing, when guys would come to me way back and say, I can go sleep around, it doesn't affect anything. It's not a big deal. And after I would get them honest, I would say, okay, do you stop at any point in time and realize that you are now using people for your own gratification? And they go, oh, I never thought of that. And so I say, what you're really doing is swapping your drug from crack or meth to a person. And now you're using them in addictive type behavior, and it's all about you. It's not about truly loving people, it's about using people. But then further, the more that you do it, the more that you just use people and you don't even care about whether you hurt them or not, whether you're sensitive to them or not. All you want to do is get your gratification, and it deepens a selfishness in you, but it also is returning you to kind of an addictive mindset of using again and medicating. So that is just something I put out to clients at times as an important thing to think through if they want to head down that road. Another thing that happens with a lot of people, and again, they're not honest about it initially, but later it sometimes hits them, is that afterwards there's a certain amount of shame and guilt. either because they know they've gone back into behaviors that they're not proud of, or behaviors that have been problem behaviors in the past that could get them into trouble, and so they feel guilt and shame afterwards. Another important thing is this, and we're going to develop it a bit more in a minute, but I want you to see that sex can often short circuit the development of true healthy intimacy. And I'll explain that in just a bit. Do you realize that when relationships start based on sex, the divorce rate is higher if they get married? So in other words, another way to say that is when you build a relationship that has the foundation of sex, it's a shaky foundation. And it becomes an issue down the road. I asked a guy once, and I said, because he was sleeping around every night. He would say, I got to find me some tail tonight, and all of that kind of stuff. And I go, does it ever get boring? And he said, it gets boring. And I says, do you know the difference between animal sex and healthy human sex? And he said this, I don't know if I know what healthy human sex is, but I know what animal sex is, which is just a physical orgasm. And he said, that's what gets boring, is just another physical orgasm. And so what happens when it becomes an addiction, or you use it outside of its design, it will become like a drug, and it will become less and less satisfying, and more empty and boring. Then it subtly changes you. So I had another client who proudly told me in the first counseling session that he was a sex addict, a porn addict, but he liked hard porn, and he was a porn connoisseur, and he studied porn every day for hours a day. And then he proceeded to tell me, but it hasn't affected me. And I thought, oh my goodness. So I watched this guy. And do you want to know what happened? Whenever anybody would talk about any topic, from pouring milk to buying butter or whatever, he came out with a sexualized twist on what they're saying. So it changed how he listened to every conversation, how he saw every person now went through that, but he didn't even realize it. And I hope at some point he did. One of the huge results of this is that when sex becomes kind of the main focus and it becomes the thing that the relationship is built on, it creates a lot of insecurity in both parties. Because basically, women have this feeling that if they don't attract a person and keep them excited sexually, they will go off and find somebody else. So the only way to keep this guy grazing on home pastures is I got to give it good and I got to give it often. And if I'm not, I'm really insecure and feeling jealousy that he's going to find somebody else. So that is a huge issue for a lot of people. And then they get preoccupied with, do I look good enough? Should I go on another diet? Should I work out more? And it creates constant insecurity. But take that further. What I want them to realize is what they're really asking or thinking is this. Do they love me for who I am or only because of the sex? Because if they only love me for the sex and they don't love me for who I am, I will constantly be insecure. And that is something that needs to be looked at. Because the person you're with should love you for who you are. And that should be the foundation of the relationship. And again, many people begin to feel like a sex toy, a piece of meat, well, however you want to say it, and that becomes an ongoing thing. So here's one of the things that I've had women say to me. I have always flirted with men, and I love the attention that they give when I flirt. But one day I woke up and realized that all the attention they were giving me was only one kind of attention, sexual. Then I hated the attention I was getting because I said, stick it somewhere, buddy. Don't you want me for me? And so I would say to them, stop flirting. And so they'd stop flirting, and then they'd come all panicky. Well, no guys are paying me any attention. And so insecurities begin to surface. The next thing that many people find is when you have been very sexually promiscuous, it makes trust difficult in relationships. There's constant fear that they're going to cheat on you, or they're afraid that you're going to cheat on them. And that usually is based on the fact that you've done it in the past, and that's been part of your lifestyle. Final thing, and I've had many people say this to me, is one of the things that they struggle with is this photo gallery in their mind of images and experiences that plays in their mind on a regular basis. And it can take them to very unhealthy and often dark places. So those are some of the things. Now, next thing I want you to think about, sometimes, and this is my wacky brain, I would imagine a Martian, if there is such a thing, arriving in Winnipeg, and they want to get a sense of Canadian culture by watching us. And so here's what I think they would say. They would look at rape is an issue in this culture, sexual abuse, prostitution, devaluation of women, human trafficking, all parts of big problems in our culture. What's the common ingredient? People who don't have good boundaries around sex. Oh, so to a Martian, they go, they got sex issues in that culture. And then take it further. They would begin looking at physical and emotional problems, medically, psychologically within our culture, sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, AIDS, abortion. So a lot of people sleep together and then find out they're pregnant, and then birth control for them is abortion, which then causes guilt for them and lots of problems. You have children who the parents bring the child into the world but can't handle it, so they end up in the CFS system, or they're put into adoption, and then divorce and the damage that it does to the children and the trauma it creates for them, all of those things that lead to broken homes and then the affairs. And I think a Martian would say it's probably causing more problems in this culture than any other thing. And I think that's right. We just don't like facing that reality, that it's probably caused more problems in our culture than even drugs and alcohol. Okay, now some of you are going to say, sounds like Tim doesn't like sex. You want to know something? Tim loves sex. Sex is a wonderful thing. But I work in a field where I have seen that sex can become a very damaging thing. Sex can become a thing that leads to huge problems. And that's the part that I want you to see. And so I would say that one of the leading causes of relapse for people in recovery is related to sex. Getting into a relationship too soon, getting into a relationship, and then sexual problems, and then affairs, which leads to relapse. So it is an issue that we deal with on a daily basis here at React, because it is such a prevalent problem for people trying to build a healthy life. But I hope what you've also realized, it's not an easy problem to fix. It's difficult to get healthy when you're in a culture that promotes sexual distortions and unhealthy stuff, and around people that are talking about all that they do. It's hard to get healthy in that. So let me just go to 3 things that hopefully will be some healthy tools for you. Okay, number 1, if you have a porn addiction or a sex addiction, it means you still have physical needs. Now, there is a slight difference. If you have a food addiction, you still have to eat, okay? If you have a sex addiction, yes, you still have a sex drive, but do you know that it's possible to be sexually abstinent? Now, some of you just about had a heart attack there. And I have told clients this: why don't you try sexual abstinence for 1 month? And they get this panic look on their face. You want to know what happens when people who abstain for a month, they come back to me and they go, I didn't believe the insights I got into myself by being abstinent. So that's just an option, okay? For some, they still need to have some release through masturbation. And what I say to them is that can be perfectly fine, but it does bring with it potential pitfalls. So be aware of the problems that could come if that is part of what you need to do. What is so important for people to understand is this. Everybody with a sexual addiction, what we are finding out is they never had healthy attachment as a child. They never felt connected. So what sex porn addiction is their attempt at trying to find connection. It does not work. So here's where you have to start. If you have a porn or sex addiction, you have to start not just with abstinence or lots of kind of boundaries and accountability. Those all have their place, but you need to start learning how to connect in healthy relationships. Now, don't start with somebody that you could fall in love with romantically. Start with somebody that's not going to be an issue, and you can learn how to begin to form healthy attachment. That becomes the starting point of defeating porn and sex addiction. Okay, next thing. We've already talked about the difference between animal sex or healthy sex or soul sex. Know the difference. Know when you're sliding into unhealthy sex and know what healthy sex is. So unhealthy sex, there doesn't have to be true intimacy. Okay? There doesn't have to be commitment and there doesn't have to be any authenticity. That is animal type sex. It's just going through the act. But healthy sex isn't that you just connect physically, it's that you've connected souls first. So there's an emotional connection. There is authenticity, there's safety, there's being able to take off masks and to open up. There is the ability to form true commitment to another person. And in that type of intimacy, sex then becomes the cherry on top. And it creates the final fulfillment of the pleasure of that kind of intimacy. So know the difference between those two things. So I get asked this. When is sex appropriate in a relationship? And I'm not going to give you black and white, hard and fast rules. I want you to think about this conceptually. So I ask clients this. When you have sex, what kind of emotions does it create? So do you know that when you have sex, it releases oxytocin? And what does oxytocin create in the brain? It creates a sense of commitment, a sense of closeness, a sense of connection. But if it's only oxytocin and there hasn't been intellectual or emotional intimacy, you have the feelings of emotional intimacy, but they're not really there. It's just the physical oxytocin. But sex creates feelings of emotional intimacy. So here's what I say to clients. If you think about it, let's not get the cart before the horse. So if the horse is before the cart, it goes like this. You meet somebody, you develop intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy, and as that deepens, there's a desire for growing commitment to each other, and then the desire for completion of sexual intimacy. But if you start with sexual intimacy, and then you wake up and say, I guess we're in a relationship and I feel really jealous if you go talk to other people and I don't even know you yet. So let's start getting to know each other now. The cart got before the horse. And that gets everything all mixed up. And so, when you think about it, sex makes the most sense when it's found in a committed relationship, where there's already safety and healthy intimacy. So guess what that means? When you start relationships, you don't start the first night in bed. You start by building a friendship. And out of the friendship develops a deeper friendship, which leads naturally to the feelings connected to sex. Now, for some of you, what I've just said to you is probably the first time you've ever heard that. And I go, wow, that shows where our culture is at when that is brand new information. I hope it gives you something to think about, and I hope it helps you begin to realize I got to figure out boundaries for myself in this area of sex, because if I don't, I could get into a whole bunch of trouble that could easily lead to a relapse.